Good afternoon. I'm Keith Spencer. We're the Legal Hour, sponsored by Bailey and Gallion. Today, we're here at the Legal Cafe on Main Street in Fort Worth, where you can get a cup of coffee and talk to a lawyer and find out some answers to your questions. Today is going to be an interesting day. We're going to be talking about what everybody's been talking about for the last month, immigration, and what's going to happen. All through the campaign season, we've been listening. I'm going to do this about immigration. No, you're not. I'm going to do that. And the problem is, it's really hard to guess what can even legally be done. Very few things in the law can be fixed with a 7-second soundbite. As a result, you have to get into the details where the devil is, but nobody wants to seem to talk about that. But I have found Katherine Hawkins here today. And Katherine is an immigration attorney with the firm of Bailey and Gallion, and she has a better crystal ball than I do, and she has some ideas about what we might see and what we might not see in the field of immigration now that the election is over, and what's going to happen, and can any of these campaign promises actually come to fruition? We don't know. But Katherine, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Where do you office?
I'm actually in two offices. On Mondays and Tuesdays, I office out of Mansfield on Debbie Lane. And on Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, I'm off Summit Avenue here in Fort Worth.
Okay. Well, immigration. It's been the hot topic all through the election cycle. And there are a lot of promises going back and forth. And I know you have a lot of clients whose very lives are hanging on some of these things. What do you think are going to be the real priorities come January?
So just because this is a new administration, it's also an old administration. So our predictions can be a little bit more sure-footed this round based on what we experienced in the previous Trump administration. I practiced immigration law at that time as well, and I think that primarily this presidential administration is going to be more focused on going back to his policies for removal. Currently, the removal policies are really focused on violent crimes, and if you haven't committed a violent crime as a non-citizen, they're not prioritizing removal at this time, or even detention at this time. There's a small subset of people who are mandatorily detainable, and they are, if it's a threat to national security or a threat to public safety, which is based on, it's arguable whether or not someone's a threat to a public safety and a threat to border security. And outside of that, they're widely releasing people and setting hearings for far in the future. Or even doing prosecutorial discretion where the government attorneys or immigration judges are choosing to administratively close or terminate proceedings in light of a different form of relief, maybe through USCIS. But in the previous administration, what we saw is the smallest traffic infraction could cause a person to be detained for a period of months and be placed in removal proceedings that moved a lot more quickly. Well, until the pandemic,
Pandemic killed everything.
It did. It truly did. But I actually had a client who got pulled over in Johnson County for not using a turn signal to change lanes and was detained for 3 months following that. And that's just not what we're seeing in this administration. So it is something to be cognizant of if you don't have a driver's license, which it's difficult to get a driver's license in Texas without work authorization. It's almost impossible. And so it's imperative that if you don't have a driver's license and you're a non-citizen, that you follow all traffic laws and continue to exercise as much discretion and as much caution as possible to avoid.
Well, I was chatting with my wife and I told her I found it hard to believe that 20 million people are going to voluntarily line up and march to the border willingly. But I'm getting the impression that perhaps we're not looking at something quite so onerous to begin with, that there may be priorities on who they want to be looking at more closely?
Yes, and that actually started in the Obama administration, where this kind of collaboration between ICE officers and local law enforcement officers, where they have a 72-hour holding period, where if someone pays on bond for a DUI or even a family assault case or something like that, if they pay cash bond for their criminal case, then they'll still hold them for 72 hours to see if ICE wants to come pick them up. And we see that. I think it's been enforced less, unless it's high priority cases. I think we'll see those happen more often.
Is it true that there's a really big difference across the states in terms of how things have been enforced, and do you expect that to continue?
I do. I think that we'll see a strong divide between red and blue states for sanctuary cities, like we did in the previous administration, because the cooperation with ICE and local law enforcement is completely voluntary. It is not compulsory at this time, but there are some governors, like Governor Abbott and Governor DeSantis, that are issuing mandates for law enforcement agencies and even hospitals to keep record of non-citizens that they are housing and treating.
Okay. So let's talk about the mass deportation a little bit. It seems to me that the courts will probably be involved some way in terms of whether or not any of this can actually happen. But from the viewpoint of logistics, it would seem that it's real easy to say, yeah, we're going to deport a zillion people, right, but logistically that may be kind of a big log to roll over.
No, I completely agree. So you'll hear people on both sides crying fire, right? We've got people on who are working in the trenches with immigrants every day that are like fearing deportation camps, like mass camps that we haven't seen since World War II, when Japanese Americans and German Americans were rounded up and throughout the pendency of the war. And then there's other people that's like, there's no way that we have the manpower to do that. So it's possible that he will first ask governors to lend more manpower than they already have with the 72-hour holds, and continue to ask them to house them in county or state facilities. But I don't know if he will incentivize with maybe government funding or something like that. It's possible. We actually also saw that in 2001 when we had some concerns about terrorism following the 9/11 attacks. And it's possible that we can edge into some murky waters there as far as who is willing to cooperate and who isn't. But I do imagine that the Ninth Circuit is always been very much someone who would fight against something like that, any type of executive orders that might come down, the same way that the Fifth Circuit has fought against a lot of the administrative actions made by President Biden during his administration this year.
Yeah, executive orders are a little bit of a murky area.
They are.
In and of themselves. One of the difficulties that I see frequently, and I do mainly family law, but there is, I think, a tendency for someone who's undocumented to be very, very wary of the police, and to the point that they're afraid to report when they are the victim of a crime. How do we get around that? What do we do about that?
I mean, that's an excellent question, and it's a question that we've been asking for a long time, and that's why the U visa program was even created. So victims of specific enumerated crimes, and there are about 21 of them, they have the opportunity to possibly apply for a visa if they were not only the victim of a specific crime, but they also cooperated with law enforcement in the investigation, detection, or prosecution of that crime. And so that was created to try to build some trust between law enforcement officials and non-citizens so that they would report when they're victims of crime, especially family assault, especially felonious assault of any type, really, or armed robbery, or they're big crimes that should be reported because they're usually committed by violent offenders who are dangerous to other parts of the community as well. So I do fear that if we have additional local law enforcement involvement in removal deportation proceedings, that the work that has gone in to create the U visa program is going to take several steps back, because the trust that is being built is tenuous at best, and I think that it will start to deteriorate.
Well, I think we have to remember too that some of these folks have come here from other parts of the world where perhaps law enforcement is not viewed as perhaps as trustworthy as we like to think they are.
Yeah, well, and they're coming from police states. I mean, I would say many people who are fleeing other governments are fleeing the law enforcement too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm coming from a number of stories where, the police officers are not the good guys. When I was actually in Guatemala, I went into a church service, and the preacher there was preaching about, you don't want your child to grow up to be a police officer, do you? You want your child to be honest and trustworthy and gentle and approachable. And that was the whole sermon.
Wow.
him preaching against the perils of someone becoming a person of the character of a police officer in Guatemala. And so, it's already, we're working against that original bias, that home bias. But then also, if it's going to get them in federal trouble in any way, it really makes them vulnerable to say, hey, this happened to me. Here's my address. Here's my name. Here's the name of whoever else was involved. So when kids are victims of crime, especially sexual crimes, they won't tell their parents and they won't tell the police because they don't want to tell the police where their parents live.
I see.
And this can even happen to kids who are citizens whose parents are non-citizens.
Right.
Yeah.
My wife was telling me, she was a retired school teacher, that a child had been telling, a story in an oral presentation in class about the hiding place they have for dad to hide in case the federales or anyone else shows up, because the kids are here legally, but dad's not, and so they have a hiding place. And it reminded me of the diary of
Anne Frank. Yeah, absolutely.
And so there is such a broad spectrum of folks in this country. Some of them are undocumented. Some of them are here with a temporary lawful status, and I think there's a kind of a rainbow of groups who are in the country with the blessing of the immigration authorities, and I think sometimes we tend to see the media lumping them all together.
Yeah.
And so, can you kind of discuss a little bit about what a temporary lawful status is and how that differs from some other folks?
Sure. So I find that the most one of the biggest trigger words that people use are illegal, and typically that means someone who has crossed over the border without permission, because that was an unlawful entry. But there are lots of people who cross over lawfully, who just overstayed their status. So I don't know if they lump those all in together either. But many people who approach the border and present themselves to be inspected or admitted or paroled are seeking asylum. Mm-hmm. And so they'll be detained because they don't have a visa to enter, and often released following it's called a credible fear interview. And if the ICE officer decides that their testimony is credible because they have any type of actual hard evidence, or because they are a credible person, they'll release them on a certain type of parole that permits them to be adjustable later, to obtain a green card later in the future. And if they don't, they will admit them on a different type of parole where they are released and they are here with permission but only pending their removal proceedings. And so that's one type of person who maybe crossed unlawfully because they didn't have a visa, but they obtained permission to be here. Another group is called temporary protective status. It's literally TPS, and that's only a certain number of countries. I
think you showed me a list of these countries that for various reasons. For example, I see Ukraine and Afghanistan are on there, which Somalia. We know there's wars going on there.
Right, and you might assume, and then Afghanistan, to a lot of, that didn't become a temporary protective status until the fall of Kabul in 2021.
I see.
So it's recent, and Ukraine too, also after the initiation of the Russian and Ukrainian war. But then we have Venezuela, which actually President Trump designated Venezuela as a TPS country. That was one of the last things he did in his previous administration. But the other ones he did specifically try to pull their protection. El Salvador specifically. El Salvador has been in temporary protective status as well as Nicaragua since the 90s. So they have to renew every 2 years, but they've had that protection for a long time. By comparison to Afghanistan or Ukraine or Venezuela. We have Yemen and Nepal. Yemen always gets renewed right at the end, where we never know if it's going to be renewed or not. Nepal, Haiti, South Sudan, Syria. It's only if you're from that country, and it's only if you are here on a specific date. So if you came from Venezuela after July of 2023, you actually don't qualify for Venezuelan TPS.
I see.
You can apply for asylum if you've experienced the specific particularities that it takes to be eligible for asylum. But TPS is really difficult to get, and it's a very, very specialized type of status versus like DACA, which is broader. And DACA is also a temporary protective status for people, children. They were children. I call everybody who has DACA kids. Not all of them are younger than me, but it's because they came here as children. Or they didn't come here as children. They were brought here as children at a time where they didn't have an option. They didn't have enough autonomy to choose whether or not to come.
Right.
So either they entered on a visa and overstayed, or they entered without status, and they were here in 2006, and they were under a certain age period in 2012, and it is still a specific set of rules, and they're not taking well, that's not true, I guess. They are taking new applications if you didn't obtain DACA back between 2012 and 2017. But they're not processing those applications. They're just taking your filing fee and sitting on it. And that DACA program, the previous Trump administration, it ended it by executive order. That was challenged in court. It went up to Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said in the method that he ended it, he couldn't.
Okay.
So it was given some Supreme Court protection when all of that occurred. But there are still ways for it to be dismantled.
What does your crystal ball tell you? That you think is a possible scenario we might see in the next year or two with regard to DACA?
I do think we'll see litigation with DACA again, just because the status is temporary. It's every 2 years.
Okay.
They have to renew their status. And if we see any litigation on it, it's likely that the people who can renew will still be able to renew until it's resolved. We have a different Supreme Court now than we did the last time it went up. And so if it will be more careful, and it probably will be in the next 2 or 3 years instead of the first year.
I've been watching the Supreme Court pretty carefully as it is evolving. And I know that there's a tendency in the media to want to say, they went right or they went left,
Right.
or a conservative went over and joined the liberals, and all of that.
Right.
But my experience with the present Supreme Court that we have, and I try to read as many of their opinions as possible, this is a very careful Supreme Court. They are issuing very lengthy, very scholarly opinions based upon separation of powers and the Constitution, and it's complex enough that I think it's difficult for the media to actually keep up and try to dumb it down for all of us to explain what's going on. But there is an issue in immigration that I've thought about for years, and that is that we only issue a finite number of visas for people to come over. Mm-hmm. And when I last looked, they were having a lottery once a year, mm-hmm. and it was a surprisingly low number of winning tickets, and they were all gone by the end of that month.
Yep.
And the fact of the matter is that we need more immigrants than those limited golden tickets will accommodate. Do you think that we will see a measurable increase in avenues for legal immigration in the coming administration?
So I don't practice employment-based immigration, but my prediction is if we see an increase, it will be there for professionals to come over, which is potentially good for us and potentially bad for the places they're leaving, right? They call it the brain drain.
Right.
If they try to incentivize highly educated people out of where they are, which may not be a highly educated place, and to come to the United States to do things and to incentivize with a visa it's a pretty good incentive.
Sure.
And so I'm guessing it's possible that will increase. We hit that maximum every year, pretty soon into the year, and I think that would increase. What I think we should see is an increase in U visas, which they have a very low number of U visas that they approve every year. They're so far behind; it's taking 10 years to adjudicate an application.
Wow.
Approximately. I think the number is 10,000 a year. I'm not actually entirely sure, but I think it's something
really low
low. And it would be good to see that if we're taking a tough on crime stance as an administration, I think that would be supportive of that goal.
Well, with legal avenues more available, it would seem like that would be a consideration the courts would take into account in terms of trying to police the less desirable people who are coming across illegally.
Sure.
We're not lumping them all together. If you have a clean record and this sort of thing, here's an avenue for you that's not so burdensome.
You know what is so funny is that was the goal of the Biden Parole in Place the Biden Parole in Place program. The goal of that was to take people who were spouses of United States citizens, or if they were children under the age of 21 of a United States citizen, which stepchildren are included. Okay. In that number. Even if they came over unlawfully, but that's pretty much their only infraction, no criminal history, you have proof that you've been here about 10 years, you paid your taxes, you have all of that evidence, then they will give you the opportunity to apply for a green card if you can get that parole in place. Essentially, it's a forgiveness of the unlawful entry. Okay. That was the goal, was to kind of just create that avenue, and it was struck down. It's pending with the Fifth Circuit right now. A lot of the things
that we've seen, it seems like, gosh, this sounds like a good idea. Let's do that. We strike a pin, and they're saying, you can't do it with the strike of a pin. Congress has to do this, or another agency has to do this. You did it the wrong way, and because of that, we can't enforce it.
Right.
How much does it cost in terms of application fees and that sort of thing?
So, the interesting, I almost said cool. It kind of is a cool thing about USCIS is that they're self-funded. So when the government shut down, the last couple of times the government has shut down, USCIS kept trucking along.
Okay.
So I have friends that work in the immigration court system. They're not self-funded, even though they do have filing fees. It's smaller, and they couldn't work. But I was still going to USCIS. We were still filing fees. We were okay. But every application has a different fee. There are very few applications that don't have fees. An example of that might be a VAWA application. So Violence Against Women's Act doesn't only apply to women, but primarily women are the ones who are the primary applicants. They're abused women or men of United States citizen spouses or lawful permanent resident spouses, if we get deep into the weeds. And because they were married and lived with someone who abused them, who potentially they could have gotten a green card through that marriage, and now they can't because they left their abuser, or because their abuser won't help them. You don't have to leave in order to qualify, but you should for safety purposes, if you can. There's no filing fees associated with any VAWA application, but that's pretty rare. And the U visas technically don't have filing fees either, unless you need a waiver, and then that you do have a filing fee with the waiver.
I can tell you, as a divorce attorney, an alarming number of people will say, "I'm going to divorce them. Can I get them deported?" Yeah. And I'm saying, "Yeah, that's not in our wheelhouse. That's not our." You're talking to the wrong person, okay? But no, I don't think you can get them deported because you're tired of them as a spouse. There are, as we said, a vast array of people, and I'm guessing that immigration is a lot like family law. It all comes down to the specific facts in your case.
Does. Oh yeah, every application is unique.
Yeah, and it's really hard to try and lump groups together. But if someone has an immigration issue or a concern, I find a lot of people have concerns that you can make them happy by telling them, no, you're okay.
Right.
Okay, but they don't know that, all right? But if someone has a concern, what would you urge them to do? Because God bless Google, but if you try and rely on Google for your legal advice, you're taking a real chance because those answers haven't always been properly vetted.
Oh, no, that's the truth. And AI doesn't know everything either, okay? ChatGPT has a lot of answers, but not all the answers are correct. But I would recommend consulting with an immigration attorney. Our immigration team is relatively small, but we speak Spanish. And we are in the Dallas office, Mansfield office, and Fort Worth office. And so whatever is more convenient to you, we can do via phone, online, or you can come in person. But, there are even times when I'm in a consultation and there's some case-specific facts that I have to look up.
Sure.
I had somebody come in just this week with a really unique type of entry document. I had never seen it before. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can't say that I've been practicing for 6.5 years, and it's just that I had never come across it. And so your facts could be unique. You could fall into a TPS category that you just weren't aware of. Maybe your parents benefited from something where you actually are a derivative of those applications. We've found that before, and we can find information on you that the government has through Freedom of Information Act requests, so we can know what we're working with in as far as whether or not it will affect your application in the future. So I definitely think that consulting with an immigration attorney, if you have any concerns at all, is going to be one of the best decisions you can make. Even if we say that we can't help you, at least you'll know where you can stand.
Okay. Well, I think the summary that I'm getting from this is we've got a few ideas about where things might be going, but again, the proof's in the pudding, and we're going to have to wait for some of them. But what's really important, if you've got an issue like this, Don't ask Bubba at the bowling alley. I mean, he intends well, but he may not be really familiar with the brand new case that just came out, and or this new statute or this new program.
Right.
And funny thing about the law, okay? We use $5 words all the time, okay? And these are words that you and I might use around the kitchen table, and we think we know what that word means. But when you get into the statute, it's a defined term.
Yeah.
And so a word like consideration, we think we know what consideration means, but if you're in a contract dispute, it is something very different and very specific.
Truly.
So you really do want to talk to a lawyer who has experience in the field. And I mean, if I needed an appendectomy, I'm not going to go ask my next door neighbor, who's a landscape artist, okay, what his opinion is on that, because it's just too important, okay? How much do you charge for an initial interview?
$50.
$50, okay? To get some real information from someone who can actually look up your case and tell you how the facts really apply to you and which statutes apply to you. And you know, as we said, we do a lot of virtual interviews here.
We do.
Where it's just online. It's just our cameras and we're talking. And so I would urge you to take that opportunity to contact an attorney or to contact Katherine and try and get some good information that you and your family can rely on. Katherine, what's the best way they can get in touch with you?
So if you give us a call at 214-252-9099, we can get you set up with a consultation. I would encourage you to do it before the inauguration to see if the inauguration or the change in administration has a likelihood to affect your case. If you can get it filed before then, and it should be filed before then, like prosecutorial discretion, naturalization information, or anything like that, I would encourage you to do it as soon as you can, just so we can strategize with you and help you determine when would be the best time to file your case.
I want to add to that because she said something that is critically important. When Congress passes a law, they can't retroactively change the law.
Exactly.
And so if you are concerned that I might qualify under the law as it is in place right now, but I might not under whatever they pass in the future, time is of the essence. I mean, we're almost to December. Okay, I would get that question answered quickly because you may have very different options a month from now.
Right.
Thank you all for joining us today. That's all we've got. We're with Bailey and Gallion. This is the Legal Hour, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.